let's talk about the paints that I normally have on my palette just for every painting that I do. I used to say I've typically used Gambling Color. They are, to me, the price point's really good. The quality is excellent. You know, here they're made in the United States, so I don't have to feel like I'm importing something from Europe in order to paint. I like that. So I will tend toward Gamblin paint whenever I can. I like to use their titanium zinc white and their titanium white for my whites. The titanium zinc white is maybe a little bit chalkier than just the titanium white. If I'm going to be doing a human portrait, though, I will use a flake white or a lead white because it's a little bit more transparent. The titanium whites and the zinc whites are exceedingly opaque, and I only use those for animal paintings and landscapes. They just, to me, they don't look good for human portraits, so I'll shy away from those and I'll use the flake white instead. You have to be super careful if you do decide to use a flake white. It's really truly got lead in it, so I always paint with gloves on when I'm using those. In fact, I paint with gloves on for the most of the time. Cadmium red medium is my preferred warm red. If you don't like to use cadmium colors, and a lot of people don't, I totally get it. They are toxic if they get into your skin. Again, use gloves. I use the permanent, this is permanent red medium by Rembrandt. This is a really good substitute in terms of color and tone for the cadmium red medium. It has some different properties, so it isn't going to mix up exactly the same as the cadmium red medium, but it's really close. So if you want something that's not really as toxic, go with the Rembrandt permanent red medium. On the cool side of the reds, I like to have both a warm and a cool red out. I will use quinacridone magenta. Sometimes I will use an alizarin crimson, but I treat that more as a purple. I have problems with alizarin. It's first of all, a real alizarin crimson it's transitive, meaning it fades quickly and turns black quickly. So I personally don't like using it all that much these days. I used to use a lot of it. I'm getting away from it now. I'm kind of moving more toward this quinacridone magenta. Now I like to have an orange on my palette. You don't need it. You can mix it up yourself with the reds and a yellow. But I do like to have a cadmium orange or a similar orange on my palette. Especially if I'm doing landscape work. Not so much if I'm doing portrait, but I will use it in landscape. And I'll also, in my landscapes and my animal paintings, I'll often use cadmium orange mixed with cadmium red in kind of varying amounts as an underpainting, just so that I get the canvas shifted away from white. And this, when it shows through, it's kind of got a nice little punch to it. For yellow, I will typically go toward Gamblin Cadmium Lemon. You can use any of the other cadmium colors if you like to. You can experiment with them. Over time, I've just found out that this is a really nice general yellow that I can use, and I know how to use it. I know it's predictable. Again, it's cadmium, so if you don't like to use it, you can substitute something else, but I've gotten used to how this works. Again, I always paint with gloves, so it's not a problem. But you can use any of the other related colors. We're not going to talk about things like yellow ochre in the moment, but you can also use yellow ochres and other ochre type colors as well as for yellows. Cobalt blue is my preferred go-to middle of the road blue. It's as close to a true blue as I have found so far. It's my favorite blue overall. It's also super expensive, especially the better quality ones. So a lot of people try to substitute ultramarine blue instead. And I do use ultramarine blue. I don't have one out here right now because I don't have a tube at the moment. But ultramarine blue is very purple. Cobalt blue is really a true middle-of-the-road blue. I like it overall kind of as the general blue that I'll use all the time. Ultramarine blue I'll only use in certain circumstances. I don't use a lot of ultramarine blue because it is too purple. It's tough for me to use it. I usually don't paint with that many purples, so I'll tend just to use one blue. The other type of blue that I'll use is this indigo type blue. It's a stable indigo blue by Gamblin. It's a little bit more purple than cobalt, and it's quite a bit darker than cobalt. So I will use it like in shadows or in the darker areas of animals, or even in human hair if it's really, you know, like a dark haired person. But I don't use it quite as much because it is so dark. You can get a similar blue if you mix either ivory black or Payne's gray with cobalt. So you really don't need this indigo type blue. It's kind of a nice color to have for me, but it's not really necessary. Ivory black has been my go-to dark for a very long time. However, I am starting to substitute that with Payne's gray, again by Gamblin. I don't have a tube of it at hand, but either ivory black or the Payne's gray work really well. There is a difference though. Ivory black is really, it's a super deep blue into the black. Payne's gray is really a dark blue that's grayed down. It's not as rich as ivory black, but it can give you some really nice effects when you mix it with other colors. So it's up to you, but it's nice to have at least a little tube of ivory black hanging around if you need to go super dark, such as in hair or you know, dark spots in the landscape. But these days I tend to use that Payne's gray for that. So next we're going to talk about some of the modifier colors like the browns, the ochres, things that I'll use sparingly, greens, things that you could mix up, which I like to have on hand, but don't necessarily use all the time. All right, next let's talk about some of the modifier colors that I use. So these are some of the modifier colors that I will typically use in a painting. And what you see here is what I would normally use for either landscape painting or one of my animal paintings. So again, it's mostly Gamblin. I'm really moving more toward Gamblin now just to keep things consistent. And I just love their colors. I like the paint quality. It's nice and buttery. I don't have to fight with it. It's really super saturated with color, so there's not a lot of filler in it. I always use the artist quality paint because again, it's not filler, it's paint. And you want, it's so hard to mix some of those student grade paints because they're mostly just filler and there's not a lot of pigment. Whereas with an artist quality oil paint, you get a lot of bang for your buck. You get a lot of pigment load. So it's a lot easier to get the mixtures that you want. But let's go over some of the modifiers that I'll use in my palette. And I don't use these in every painting, but this is a typical set that I'll use in my landscapes and animal paintings. So let's start here with the ochres. I like to have a yellow ochre light around. This is an old tube that I honestly still have. Daniel Smith doesn't make these 150 mil tubes anymore, but either Daniel Smith or I also have a Gamblin yellow ochre here. I'll use the yellow ochre a lot if I want modified yellows. So it's yellow but with a little bit of brown in it. I just like that earthy tone in some of my paintings, so I'll use the ochres to mix up greens in that case. Sometimes I mix my own greens, and sometimes I mix I mix in some pre-made greens. I typically won't use greens right out of the tube because they're usually too intense. That's not what I see in the landscape when I'm out there, but I'll use these to kind of modify my own mixtures. The ones that I have here are the ones I'm kind of working toward right now as the typical ones that I'll use. Chromium oxide green. Again, this is by Daniel Smith, but I have a Gamblin version as well. I'm trying to use up this old tube of Daniel Smith paint. But a chromium oxide green is really great out here, especially in the western US, because our greens out here tend not to be as bright and intense as, let's say, in a wetter area. Like I live in the desert in Tucson, so we don't have a lot of super intense green out here. It's much muted. So I'll use these muted greens to modify the landscape colors that I'll use. Sap green, I do not use this very often. It is really intense. It's not as intense as some of the phthalo greens, but it's just really super green. And I honestly, I don't use it a lot. You can mix it with like a cool red, like a quinacridone red, or even alizarin crimson if you still use that, to get a really deep, intense dark. But I just have it on my palette here once in a while. As a modifier, it isn't necessary. Cadmium chartreuse is really a green yellow. I like it, again, in very certain situations. I use it very sparingly, but it's nice to have around as a mixture, especially when I'm painting landscapes that have a lot of spring greens or bright colors in them. And so I'll use this on, flower paintings as well. It's intense, so you don't need to use very much. And again, since it's a cadmium color, you want to make sure that you don't get it on your skin of your hands, because it will, over time, it can cause challenges with your body. So use some kind of a glove when you paint with any kind of cadmium color. This is a middle color for me. This is called Terra Verte. It's basically a green earth. It is by Gamblin, and it's an in-between color for me. Again, it's not something that I need to have. I could mix this up fairly easily, but I like to have it just as a go-to on my palette in case I need to modify. I use this in the landscape a lot. It's good here, especially in the western US, again, because we have a lot of muted greens. This is a very muted green. It seems like it's more toward the brown end of the spectrum than green, but it's a good muted green to have on hand. The pigment load isn't the best. I will say that. I wish it was a little bit higher in pigment load, but I still like to use it once in a while for a modifier. The one modifier I use a lot of, well, two I use a lot of, is raw umber and burnt sienna. Again, these are Gamblin. Raw umber, I am finding myself using this more and more rather than burnt umber, which is what used to be my go-to brown. I don't use this as much anymore. It's super dark. I'm trying to get away from that, but I still do use it in wildlife paintings and some horse paintings, and even with human portraits and hair and things like that. But I don't use the burnt umber quite as much as I used to. But raw umber and burnt sienna I find are very valuable. Raw umber is great for a lot of different. Raw umber is really, really great for a lot of different things. Like if you're going to do an underpainting, especially on portraits, raw umber can be great for that. It's also just a good brown to use in animal paintings, especially if you don't want to go super dark like you would get with burnt umber. Burnt sienna, again, is a really good modifier to have. It's a earthy red, and I like to mix it up and use this in landscapes and especially here in the Southwest where we have a lot of red dirt, and that makes some really nice mixes too. When you mix it with other reds, when you mix it with yellows, you get a really wide range of really great kind of earthy colors. Now, as far as mediums, what do I use? Well, I use Galca Gel by Gamblin. Again, you can see I'm a Gamblin shop. I use Galca Gel by Gamblin a lot. This is what I'll use in some of my bigger paintings, but I use it sparingly, but I do use it in the vast majority of my paintings because it helps the paint dry evenly. It gives the paint a nice sheen. And especially if I need paintings to dry quickly, oil painting, even here in the Southwest, oil paintings can take a while to dry between layers, so oftentimes I'll use some Galca gel mixed into the paint in order to get the paint layer to dry a little bit quicker. Sometimes I will use Galca Light, and this is a thin kind of a resin um, mixture that you can see. It's more like it has the consistency of a thin honey. So if I don't need, this is more of an impasto, like a impasto painting medium, meaning it allows you to keep the brush strokes in your work. Sometimes I want my paint to be a little thinner, and so I'll use the Galca Light. Again, this helps the paint layer dry quickly and with an even sheen. Now, sometimes I'm going to reach back here. I do always have, this is Gamblin refined linseed oil. There are times when I want to thin a bit of paint out with just linseed oil because it's just too thick, or I want to have a little bit thinner paint application. I will use linseed oil for that. So I always have at least one bottle here hanging around. Now for paint thinner, I will use Gamsol. Again, I'm a Gamblin shop, so I'll use Gamsol. You can use other odorless mineral spirits as you want to. I'm not going to get too much into that. I don't use the thinner a lot in my paint. It can really break down how the paint molecules, how they adhere to each other. So I try not to use it except in the very early layers of paint. And once I put that first layer down, I don't touch it again. I usually just use this the Gamsol for cleaning out my brush in between colors. And that's really about it. Okay, next let's move on and do just a little bit on the different grays that I typically will use. I am finding these a lot more valuable than I ever have in the past. Again, you can mix these up. You don't necessarily need to purchase them, but I do like to have some of these grays, and I think Gamblin does a really great job in covering the bases here with the different grays. My favorite is their Torrit gray, Torrit. It's only available about once a year. It's a really beautiful gray that changes from year to year. Basically, they get their Torrit gray from cleaning out all the air filters in their paint manufacture facility. And then they mix that together, and that becomes a paint that's always a beautiful tone of gray. I only get that once a year. It varies from year to year, so I'm not going to really necessarily count on that as part of my typical paint palette. But these are the grays that I will often use. Portland Gray Deep is this one here up on the palette, but it's a dark gray, very neutral, maybe a little even to the cool side. Great for mixing clouds and for distant mountains. You can use it in a lot of different applications as well. I'm finding it very useful in painting animals too. Portland Gray Medium is this one here. As you can see, it is a nice medium. It's a little bit more toward the warm end of the spectrum, so it's got a little bit more yellows and reds in it, but it's a nice medium gray. Lovely to use in clouds, especially in the landscape. It's wonderful to have. Cool gray, I don't have any out on the palette at the moment, but it is a blue gray. Beautiful again for clouds. I love this as a base for mixing clouds. You do need to mix it with a lot of white because clouds are not usually this dark, but I do like to have this in cloud mixtures and distant mountains and that kind of thing. Portland Warm Gray, I find this is lovely to use in mountain scenes and in animals, especially if the animal has a lot of white. I'll mix this up with a little bit of white so that I can knock the white down just a little bit, but it adds a little bit of warmth to the white. So those are the grays that I use. And again, you don't necessarily need to have these on hand, but a lot of people do like to have them available just in case they need them.